Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to Oxford. The question is third question of the term. I'm Charlotte. I'm a second year IT classics at Trinity. And yeah, this Oxford question for those of you who are new, these are kind of talks with time for questions that we run every other Friday. Tackling kind of the big questions people have about the Christian faith. So we've had ones on suffering and science, religion. Today, our talk is on the tainted history of the church and how this can affect its message. And so we've got a Slido. If you guys want to do your thing with that, I don't really know what you do, but scan the QR code. And so as the talk's going on, if you want to type in your questions, or at the end, you can also put your hand up, and I can facilitate that. So I'd really like to welcome our speaker, Lara. Thanks so much for coming. Also, feel free to leave. We aim to finish about 1:45, but if you've got lectures that run up to choose well, please feel free to leave. Thank you so much for coming.
Cool. Thanks. I'll just move this up here.
Be with you guys. So this question is something that has been a big one for me. I grew up in South Africa, and it was a nation which, until I was 9 years old, please don't try and figure out how old, was under the terrible apartheid regime, which oppressed so many of the wonderful people of my country. And that regime was Christian. That's just one example. In the last few months, though, in the Christian tradition that I am currently in my particular church tradition, there's been a groundswell within the church asking lots of questions. For example, there's been a book written by John Dixon, I'd really recommend it, actually, written called Bullies and Saints, looking at Christianity's checkered past. Professor Esau Macaulay is a brilliant thinker and theologian, and him, among myriad other theologians, are looking at Christianity's and reflecting on the continuing impact of racism and Christianity's role in that. There's an organization called Christianity Today, and I'd actually also really recommend you look at what they are doing. They've got a podcast called this is just one example, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which is all about a mega church and a pastor who, there was a whole scandal around bullying, among other things. There's a woman called Beth Moore, who was a real hero of mine when I was growing up, mainly because she was one of the only women I ever heard teaching the Bible, so I was really interested in her. But she's been decrying sexism in the church. And then a new favorite of mine is an amazing psychologist called Diane Langberg. So I'm just giving you all my recommendations. But she's written an amazing book, but she's looking at the terrible impact of sexual predators within church leadership. So the cry that seems to be coming out of all of this is much harm has been done, much harm is being done, and it's unacknowledged by the church. And of course, I've just been talking about this question coming from within, particularly my particular church tradition at the moment, but these questions come from all around. I remember one particular lecture I was in. I studied post-colonial African history at the University of Cape Town. And I remember one particular lecture, the lecturer had invited students to comment on the reading that we'd done for that day. And I just remember student after student standing up and just talking with abhorrence about the collusion of the church and the missionaries with the pillaging of Africa and just subjugating swathes of the continent. And as a Christian, that moment was etched in my memory. And I remember thinking how sad it was that these real and honest conversations were happening in the lecture halls, but not in the churches. I think over the last few centuries, if you ask Christians, they would denounce many of these terrible things, these dark aspects of the church's history, this tainted history of the church. But I think it's also true to say, by and large, that the church has not been on the front foot in wanting to acknowledge those things and wanting to see the wrong that was caused, the pain that was caused, and to work on considering what repentance or restitution could look like. There's been a bit of a tendency, and if you've come to this talk, you might already be thinking this, there's been a tendency to brush things under the carpet, to try and sort of minimize the harm. perhaps focus on some of the harm that other religions or people groups have done, or maybe even just to focus on the positive contributions that Christianity's made, and it might feel a bit like those are distraction tactics to someone looking on. I think human beings in general, we don't have a good track record of wanting to sit and really think about the wrongs that we've done. We aren't in general front-footed about reflecting on how our actions or words might hurt others. And we tend to have to be confronted about it first. And even then, we want to sort of squirm away maybe from some of the seriousness of the pain that was caused and the consequences wrought. So it's a common difficulty, but I think there's some additional difficulties specific to Christianity that perhaps cause anxiety or confusion. And if you're a Christian in the room today, you might identify with what I'm about to say. But this could result, and I think has resulted, in a bit of an avoidance of this particular question from within the church. So one question, sort of swirling underneath this question, is this. If Christianity is true, wouldn't we expect to see a less complex history? Doesn't the tainted history of the church actually call into question its message? Secondly, does the fact that terrible things have been part of Christian history undermine the core claims of Christianity, namely a real transformation of the individual when they become a Christian, or for society at large, hope and freedom and happiness and peace for all those who encounter the bearers of the good news? Or to go a little deeper, could the theology itself be dangerous? Does it actually lend itself to some of these abuses? When the church has done harm, is this actually a direct result of harmful teaching in the Bible? And you might be able to think of some examples. Take, for example, the critique of atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Does Christianity teach a subjugation of self that is essentially anti-life, and eventually would just weaken the convert? They just turn the other cheek. They don't have a sense of self. They're denying themselves, those sorts of things. Or on the other side of it, someone might be asking, are Christians being bullied into self-shame by cancel culture through all this talk of harm and the need for repentance? And are Christians being asked to take on too much responsibility than is fair? So I think some of these questions are just a few of the examples that are underneath why it seems that a lot of people avoid and have avoided some of the realities of this. Now, I think it's true that most of us, especially maybe living in the West, will be aware of some of the positive contributions that the church has made through history and into the present day. I don't know if any of you guys know the popular historian Tom Holland. Not the Spider-Man, the other one. He's interesting. He recently did a podcast, and he was talking about how he was, I think, agnostic/atheist, and he's sort of been moving in his beliefs. But he was saying at the time when, he was definitely not considering himself a theist at all, thought that most of his beliefs and his worldview came from the Greeks and the Romans, and just assumed that was the case. And then as he began to read literature, stories from those times, the laws, he said he became more and more aware that his deeply held views and thoughts and his whole perspective on the world didn't at all resemble the world of the Greeks and the Romans. And he said he became more and more aware that it resembled the world of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I was really struck, I wrote it down. He said this in that podcast. He said, "I feel afraid to consider a world in which the cross of Jesus Christ never happened." Speaking of the same unique contribution that Christianity has made to democracy, atheist philosopher Jürgen Habermas says this: "Universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and the collective life in solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love." And many of you will know this. The first hospitals were set up by Christians in the early church. Well, the first hospital actually was set up by Basil the Great, I think, in 370 AD. It's very boring. I like history, sorry. I'm like, I should have scratched that out. But Christian, and then, by the 1300s, there were thousands of hospitals across Europe because of this wave, and also shelters for people who were in poverty. And there was a huge emphasis on caring for the outcast. Another example that was interesting at the Council of, well, to me, sorry, Council of Clermont in 353, it was rules that a quarter of all the money within the diocese, the funds, had to be spent on hospitality towards the poor and to the foreign traveller. And so Christianity has had this huge impact, and we know that. And obviously, it's had an impact also on, as I said, on our laws, on art, on music, literature, scientific inquiry, and the list can go on. But these are things that I think most people are aware of, and I think the churches are quite good at reminding us, and we celebrate them, and I think that is a good thing, rightly so. I think there's lots that you can look at in what I've just described and say that's actually a really great thing, and I'm so glad that we have that, and that has impacted in the West some of the ways in which our worldview and what we think matters. But, and obviously you knew there was a but coming, what is frequently addressed far more frequently, infrequently, are the atrocities committed by Christians down the ages, and I just want to also list those because I've listed the good things. The Crusades, spanning from 1096 to 1229, saw 5 waves of Europeans on a quest to wage a holy war against Muslims in the Holy Land, men and women and children being brutally slaughtered in the streets in the name of God, and they even would celebrate that very night, even as the bodies were burning in the streets, and thanking God for their victory. That was the church. The Inquisitions gave us our first taste of heresy trials, and the Spanish Inquisition in particular showcased the reality of how religion attempts to control and how it uses threats to kind of keep people in line. Anti-Semitism has a shamefully long history within Christianity, and to this day, many still feel that the church has not reckoned with its role in the build-up to the atrocities done to the Jews in the 20th century. But obviously, we know it was going on far before then as well. I mentioned it already, but colonial racism in the continent of Africa, another shameful blight on the church's record. And while it's true that the colonial government was often at odds with the churchmen and women who were genuinely wanting to go and serve and set up hospitals and education systems and clean water and all these things, nevertheless, the church, even seen in that light, colluded with and participated in a process which subjugated fellow human beings. It was self-interest under the guise of Christian love. Of course, the abhorrent transatlantic slave trade from the 15th to the 19th century saw roughly 12.5 million Africans torn away from home and family, sentenced to work like animals across the sea. And even if they made it through that treacherous, chatteled sea voyage, if they made it through. And this was all on the watch of supposedly Christian nations. And in a similar vein, Christians were responsible for, as I said, the reprehensible apartheid regime in my country. Misogyny has been sadly a huge hallmark of Christian story, and lauded church leaders such as John Calvin, you might have heard, or John Wesley here from Oxford, writing things about women that would absolutely shock us. Over the last few decades as well, there have been reports of the devastating number of children who have been abused by priests in Catholic and Protestant churches, with a systemic cover-up by the institutions. That was actually one of the reasons my father decided he had to leave the Anglican Church. He was a minister there, but he had found out that years ago they tried to report a particular chaplain at a school, and found out he'd just been moved. He was a friend. It's like that's an example of the systemic cover-up, and that has just happened time and time again. And then I mentioned coming back to my own church tradition over the last few years, and that's come very close to home for me. Leaders that I really respected coming out and finding out that they were abusing people. And I could mention many of those names, and they just keep coming. And so these are really important questions that we are asking. It seems that there's a temptation to use Christianity as a guise for control and power, and that this can be traced back throughout Christian history. If we think of, if any of you, I know some study classics, if you've heard of Christian leaders like Ambrose of Milan or Charlemagne, Charles the Great, we see this sort of imposition of Christianity that changed from the first early church, where it was they had no power, and there was so much giving, and they were putting their lives at risk. They were the ones who would stay in the city when people were sick, and everyone else would just run. And the Christians were known for helping. And in fact, it was a problem for the Roman leaders, because the Christians were doing so much good that That's why people were joining the numbers. But then we see this shift, and Christianity suddenly gets power. Constantine becomes a Christian, and then we see people like this, Ambrose of Milan and Charlemagne eventually in the 700s. And we actually see people dying if they don't want to convert. John Dixon writes this: 200 years after Constantine, the Mediterranean world saw itself not just as a society in which Christianity was the dominant religion, it now considered itself a totally Christian society. Temples had long been closed, distinctively pagan laws had been rewritten, pagan professors had to resign, bishops had replaced town mayors as heads of cities. And in the East, all were required to be instructed and baptized in the Christian faith. Freedom of religion was sadly gone. And we know this. Most of you will know something of this already. And with all of this, we can ask ourselves, okay, but if Christianity can be so easily corrupted, and it has done so many bad things, and so many people who have done these things have done them in the name of God, can we actually believe that the Christian message could be true or good? Is that even a valid question anymore? And so I know I've actually gone a little bit more detail, but I just want to give you 5 thoughts from me as I've reflected on this as a Christian, why I would still want to ask someone to consider thinking of Christianity and consider particularly the claims of Jesus and that he makes in light of all of this. And so if you bear with me, I'm just going to rattle through those 5 things. But the first is this, that in the Bible, the people of God are constantly recorded as wreaking havoc. It's interesting that the gospel writers, 2 of them at least were disciples, we know that. And they themselves record themselves being arrogant. They record them standing up to Jesus and doing the wrong thing, and they record themselves abandoning Jesus in his moment of need. There seems to be, they themselves record their own mistakes and flaws. And it's interesting, just by the by, that it's actually Mark's gospel that records the most of Peter's flaws, and there's a good tradition to believe that Mark's gospel was Peter's testimony and memoirs. But this is constantly done throughout the Bible, that the leaders are not shown to be perfect or sugar-coated. In fact, the Bible's shocking. If you read it, there are shocking things all the time. Abraham does shocking things. David does terrible things. We see this time and time again. And so that's one thing that firstly encourages me. The Bible doesn't create a story that's false about Christian leaders. In fact, it shows us. And those leaders get confronted, and they bear consequences for what they do. So that's interesting for me. The first thing is I find a relief as the Bible is honest. Secondly, we see that not only is it true that religious leaders are flawed and can do terrible things, but the Bible, and particularly Jesus, makes the point that there can be lots of people who are religious in what they do and what they say outwardly, but they themselves are actually not converted. They are not actually truly close to God or following him. And Jesus categorically, I mean, if you can't get away from this when you read the New Testament, he puts absolutely no store by pompous religion. He hates it. If you read the Gospels, you think, what's one thing Jesus hates? It's religion. That's the clearest thing that seems to come out, and especially abuse in the name of religion. He reserves his harshest critiques and judgments for those people. And it's interesting, in Matthew 7:23, Jesus says that when people meet God, there will be those that God says to them, and he says they'll be the ones who have said, Lord, Lord, did we not do all these religious things in your name when we lived on earth? Were we basically not the religious, pious ones? And Jesus says, God will say to those people, depart from me, I never knew you. And there's a seriousness about that was hypocrisy and that was fake. And then the flip side of that seems to come in with the story of the prodigal son, where it seems to be telling us we should expect the opposite, that there are loads of people that we think look like they've done terrible things and they would never be close to God, but actually they were close to God. And so there's this kind of Jesus is like saying, don't judge. Don't you think you know who is actually... who actually knows God. And so some of that those terrible things that are done, and even though they're done in the name of God, might be done by someone who's not, is a hypocrite and has got no interest in God and following him. Thirdly, the Bible shows us that the theology itself can be twisted. If you know the story of Jesus in the desert, the story says that Satan comes to him, and while Jesus is fasting, this is just before he starts his ministry, every single thing that in the Bible records Satan saying is scripture. every single thing that the devil says to Jesus are the words of the Bible. But everything he's saying, he's taking them out of context and making them mean something else. And this seems to be a really important point that we should expect that all of us even can twist. We can take any bits of the text and use it to our own advantage. And so there should be an expectation that that's going to happen. It shouldn't shock us. What does that mean about what it means to read a text? If you can so easily chop it up and use it for your own advantage, which is in South Africa, they had so many verses to back up why it was fine for them to do what they did. Obviously, the transatlantic slave trade as well. I mean, you can use it for anything. And that's maybe something we can talk about in the Q&A. But the Bible seems to show we should expect that. And that means we should probably be reflecting ourselves on our temptation, if you are a Christian in the room, to use stuff to just back up what you want to say. And just be aware of that. Fourth, the Bible gives us a rationale and a mandate to know that if anyone is being mistreated, whether it's in an outward way, subtly, or in a psychological, more subtle way, that this is wrong. And this is a really important point for me, and this comes into what Christianity has given to society, I think, but it really does give us a foundation for human dignity. And I'm not saying that you can't find that in other worldviews as well, but I think it's something I hold really precious in my own faith, is that the Bible really claims that God creates every single person, and that whether we dislike them, we disagree with them, or whatever it is, that we have to respect them because God has made them. And in fact, the Bible even says God has made them in his image. And that every single human being is representing something of who God is. And that means that there's just never a mandate to ever actually deeply disrespect someone. And so that kind of that framework has often then led me to my last point, which is this, that the church has done all these terrible things in history, and that's true. But particularly that foundation, there's a theology in Christianity called Imago Dei, which is the image of God, that has meant that all the way along, Christians have critiqued the terrible things that the church has done. So from within the church, people have effectively critiqued what's happened. So when we're talking about the Crusades, I don't know if you know this, but Francis of Assisi went and in 1219, he was bravely challenging this use of violence, and he even said, can you send me across into Egypt? I want to go and just see if I can talk with the Sultan. And they did, and the Crusade leaders laughed at him and mocked him, and he almost died. He got beaten up. But actually, there's some interesting records to say that they really were thankful for him coming, and actually there was some interesting stuff written about him afterwards. From within the Muslim camp on the other side where he went. Also, I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy called Alcuin of York. If you haven't, you should read about him. He's basically responsible for our education system that we have across Europe and today. And he had the ear of Charlemagne. And we see him writing Charlemagne. Anyone else would have been killed. But he was so sort of integral and amazingly clever that Charlemagne liked him. And he used that privilege he had, and he said, Charlemagne, you're doing what's wrong. You should not be killing people. This is terrible. Christianity never allows this. And so we see throughout history, although these terrible things have been done, there's a critique. And even from outside of the church, amazing people like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, saying to these people who are saying, we're using the Bible to do these things, they read the text themselves and they say, look, it doesn't match up. And so that was the last thing that I would say for me has been encouraging, that as these terrible things have happened, and even in my life, when I've done things that I now regret and look back on and think that was bad, it's actually been often the text itself, or my Christian friends have come and challenged me and said, look, that doesn't match up what you're saying. So maybe I could just end with this thought and we can go to a time of Q&A, but Christians can do absolutely terrible things. But I think the goodness for me and the truth of the Christian message is all about Jesus. And I would say rest firmly on him. And I would encourage you, if you feel that the Christian faith is in any way dangerous or worrying, look at Christ, because any Christian will take his example and will know that he's the example to live by. And I would really ask you, and I'd be genuinely interested to know if there are things in his life that you think that doesn't match up or that looks dangerous. But I would almost challenge you to say, I think to look there. And then lastly, something Martin Luther said has always struck me. A lot of all the stuff that goes wrong for me is because Christians are arrogant. And very quickly it starts out by being thankful to God for all that God's given them, and then it changes to being morally superior. I'm a little bit better, and now it becomes tribal, and that's where these things go wrong. But Martin Luther once said that for him, Christianity was just about one hungry person telling another hungry person where to find bread and where to find something that will really satisfy them. So thank you so much for listening. I've rattled through a lot of history, but we're gonna, I think, have a time Q&A. Okay, great, thank you.